Nope. Sometimes that's my only response. I see a thing that is so dissonant with my experience of the world and the understanding, or my understanding of what is right or true or worthy, that I can't even or won't even bother to form a cohesive argument against it. I just say, nope. I overheard a conversation in the grocery store recently. One woman told another that she'd found the secret to feeling better and living longer. She gave up red meat, alcohol, sugar, and most dairy. Nope. Glad she's feeling better, but I'm going to stick with nope. Or even more weighty topics. Every time I see images of bombed-out cities and suffering civilians, and I hear some head of government here, there, or in between insist that there simply was no other option. Nope. And I have a confession this morning, too. I recently had that same reaction while reading the Bible. Judge me or join me, it was back in January, the month that saw the death of Renee Macklin Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis. It was the predictable outcome of an extraordinary flex of imperial power through an illegal nationalist and racist invasion of a U.S. city by the U.S. government. The headlines flowed through my veins as much as across the airwaves. And in that sickening moment, I read in Isaiah, "There will be no gloom for those who are in anguish." And it went on. The people who have walked in darkness have seen a great light. Nope. The hope in that text didn't resonate. It didn't feel honest in that moment. And there was another text on my mind that week, the gospel lectionary passage that I just read, which proclaims at the outset of Jesus' ministry, "For those who sat in the region of the shadow of death, light has dawned." Nope. Light has dawned? In the midst of inhumanity, receding democracy, and war? To me, it feels more as if some malevolent force has stretched its finger out and placed it upon the globe so that the spinning of the world has stopped and dawn will never come again. Are any of you with me in struggling to stay faithful, to stay hopeful that the arc of the universe really is bending toward justice? Maria got at this a few weeks ago. She's a colleague of mine at Habitat, and she heard another colleague of mine, who's also a pastor, discussing with me the season of Lent, how it can feel so dark, but also feels needed in the world right now. "Yeah," Maria said, "Lent is about lament, and that's where I am. I'm not in the mood for Easter right now." Anyone else struggling to get geared up for an empty tomb while bombs are dropping and bodies falling and hate spreading and democracy disappearing and people disappearing? I want to do empty tombs, friends, and I want to embrace the light dawning in the world. But some days all I have right now is nope. There's this other spot in the Bible where I've done the same. We have to read between the lines a bit in interpreting Paul's letters, which make up a good portion of the New Testament. The first century, for some reason, did not preserve Paul's entire sent folder and none of his inbox. With faithful interpretation, though, it seems that among those early Jesus followers in Corinth, there was diversity of thought, bickering, maybe even fractious behavior. Some, it seems, had developed a faith that came with a certain erudition, and others had a bit more of a blue-collar sensibility to their faith. Some were students of one thinker, others another. Division had set in, or so it seems. The first thing Paul says after his characteristically drawn-out salutation in that letter is, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement." Nope. Maybe I have less support on this one. Our world is so terribly, terribly divided at the moment that every time a Republican and Democrat shake hands, we all think the lion may have finally laid down with the lamb. An appeal to plain, simplistic agreement might actually feel pretty good about now. As for me, nope. Into a deeply divided community, and so by posterity into this deeply divided world, Paul offers a fix for the bitterness, the hatred, the organizational, governmental stalemate, a fix for that sour, sick feeling you get in your stomach every time you have to sit down next to that uncle at Thanksgiving. Paul has a solution for all of that division. And here is Paul's great idea. Just agree with each other. Well, why didn't I think of that, Paul? Here all this time, we've been cultivating varied life experiences across different populations, trying to find a way to curate beauty out of bringing everyone together in some way that celebrates everyone and the richness of life that doesn't center on a unified worldview, when all along we could have just been agreeing. Who needs DEI when you could have homogeneity? Nope. I don't like the idea right off the page. See, I have convictions that are worth the cost of disagreement to me. But here's the thing. The people who I disagree with also have convictions that are worth the cost of disagreement to me. Even the most local and seemingly innocuous of disagreements often stem from hurt feelings or betrayed trust. To simply overlook those things would, at best, generate a hollow and short-lived peace. But we should also recognize that not all disagreements are local or innocuous. When the world around us argues that arrest, incarceration, deportation, or even death are appropriate treatments for those arriving in our land from another, shall we just agree? Preacher, Paul was talking about agreement in the church. Don't you know that? Okay. So when we're told that policy should be set only by those who wear big, showy crosses around their necks and speak with religiosity in their voice about how God has put America first in the world, shall we just agree? Do you want to? Oh, you're ahead of me. Simmer down a little. Let's try this again. Want to say it with me this time? Nope. To simply wallpaper over our varied perspectives and force ourselves into alignment because Paul said so, or because we want to be nice, or we want to avoid conflict, robs us all of the gains that could come from our ability to reason things out, to learn more about each other, to provide new perspective and new encounter. It is entirely possible to me that disagreement is one of the most productive things we can do in the search of an equitable life for all, which may actually be the key to unlocking the gospel in Paul's prose. I mentioned that we don't have the correspondence surrounding Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. In fact, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians is probably not even Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. What if, instead of a blanket directive, Paul is speaking into a dynamic tension. Be in agreement isn't a call to mindless acquiescence, but a plea to reorient around a new goal. Instead of holding one's own perspective as the highest good, have at least some appreciation for agreement. What if Paul knew he didn't have to convince these people to hold on to their convictions because they were already clinging to them desperately? If the plea is not to prioritize agreement over personal conviction, but rather to bring a desire for agreement into parity with the love of personal conviction, then an interesting tension is created. As long as both sides of the tension are earnest. What would a community look like in which its members have a baseline goal of living in unity, but who find tension in that because they take their own convictions seriously as well? I think if we take a global or national perspective, we would have to argue that we don't know what a community like that looks like, because we're too accustomed to communities shaped by a desire to win, to control, to be right. And if we can find any counter to that at all in the wider world, it lives in overly simplistic, lukewarm calls to unity for the sake of simplicity. Can't we all just get along? That's a rally cry for the status quo, if I've ever heard one. I would argue that to find a community that values both sides of this tension, you'd have to look a little closer to home. You'd need to find a community who knows how to talk to one another, even in moments of disagreement and in moments of controversy. And when the right answer isn't easy to find, even if there are some who say it's obvious. I think in a community like this, you'll find people who are willing to listen to ideas from across various continuums, and genuinely, I cannot stress, genuinely enough, genuinely let those ideas hone their own. In a community like that, there is real comparison of ideas. The listening is not performative. But there is also robust dialogue. There are times when your opinion, earnestly considered, still doesn't change the perspective of the other. But that doesn't get you off the hook of having to listen also, and be big enough to consider and be open to change. If you could find a community like that, you'd find a community capable of withstanding controversy. You'd find a community capable of both serving their wider community and also sometimes holding their wider community to account. You'd find a community with both credibility and voice. You see, sometimes I read the Bible and I think, nope. But then I go to church, and my church says to me, nope. That's the community I found. My church. Just last night, around a table with some of my church family, Anna and I answered the question of why we decided to call Crescent Hill our home. I answered truthfully, but not fully, because I knew I got to stand here today. Some people say they picked their church because they heard from the pulpit or they heard in the community an echo of their own worldview. I didn't. Don't get me wrong. The general ethos of this place, a welcoming community of service centered around a generous theology symbolized by an inclusive table, I am 100% on board there. But in my time here, which hasn't been all that long yet, where the rubber meets the road, we've made the news for other things too. We had to figure out what to do when a dissonance between our partnerships and our mission came to light. And that conversation closely followed the wider political themes of our day. That wasn't easy. And we've contended with the fact that the financial model that has sustained the little C church and the big C this church for generations is no longer viable. We've wrestled with how we can be good stewards of our property and our space. And we've had these conversations and plenty of others. We are having these conversations and plenty of others. But I haven't heard people backing away from their convictions. On the contrary, I've heard some vigorous arguments. But I've also encountered people listening and learning and growing and moving forward together. Which is why our coffers are running over and there is no space left in our pews, and our city has become a place marked by justice and equity. Just kidding. But that is why I'm here. Because a world that is so marked by division as to be ready to flush a 250-year experiment in democracy down a golden toilet desperately needs little local communities who know how to hold conviction and agreement in tension, who know the power of varied life experience and diverse perspective, but who value agreement, who know that homogeneity is the enemy of consensus. It is from communities like that that we will once again learn to trust each other, where every voice will be heard, where no one will win because no one will lose. Communities like that may actually transform the world one budget meeting at a time. Somebody remind me of that in about half an hour, okay? Dear Crescent Hill, my church, if you, like me, have had some trouble looking out around and believing that the light of a loving God is dawning, it is only because you haven't yet realized that along with other little communities of faith and little communities of action and little communities of purpose, that light is you.